We are honored to have Dr. Barbara Esch joining us today to present her didactic on care coordination between behavior analysts and speech and language pathologists. So if I may just introduce her, though I'm sure most people have knowledge and experience with Dr. Esch. She is a behavior analyst and a speech pathologist with more than 30 years of experience in behavioral interventions for individuals with developmental disabilities. Dr. Esch has worked in the school, home, clinic, and hospital settings. Her workshops, trainings, and research have been presented in the United States, Europe, and Australia, and focus on the use of behavioral principles to improve speech, language, and feeding skills for individuals of all ages with a wide range of medical and educational diagnoses. She is the author of the Early Echoic Skills Assessment, part of the Verbal Behavior Milestone Assessment and Placement Program. So for those of you using the BB-MAP, she's the founder and past chairperson of the Speech Pathology Special Interest Group of the Association for Behavior Analysis International. So we welcome you and thank you for your time today. Haley, our clinic coordinator, will be sharing the PowerPoint, so please feel free to begin as soon as she gets those up for you.
Well, hi, everybody. I guess I didn't say hi. I just introduced myself. It's great to be able to talk with all of you. What I want to cover is based on some questions that Tina Goldsmith sent me and the information that I have. So hopefully there will be time for questions. So if I don't talk about what you want answered, then we'll go ahead and do that during the Q&A. So this slide is just to kind of get everybody on the same page that we all have the responsibility, and I think also the right to address communication skills with the kids that we work with, the learners, however old they are, and that's primarily because communication is a social skill. And we're all part of the social context of the learner in terms of the verbal community. So we can go on to the next slide. So the question, what does an SLP do? This is a list of our practice areas as speech pathologists, speech and articulation. Also, sometimes you'll see the term phonologic disorders, phoneme, sound disorders, and so on in that area. Language, which as behavior analysts we would call verbal behavior. Cognition, which is separated out by speech and language pathologists, we would also call that verbal behavior. We would call that complex verbal conditional discriminations, but they tend to call it memory and problem solving, those sorts of things. Speech pathologists also work on voice disorders and also accent reduction, those types of things. Feeding and swallowing disorders, and those are often shared with OTs, but a very well-known behavior analyst, Kathleen Piazza, and Meeta Patel, also behavior analyst. Both of those folks have published extensively in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis with respect to feeding and primarily feeding disorders, but they work very closely with speech pathologists as well in that area. We also fluency disorders, which used to be called stuttering, but it kind of encompasses a lot of other things. And then speech pathologists also work with hearing impaired individuals to help them habilitate what auditory skills they do have and to rehabilitate for those who have acquired and then lost those abilities. The American Speech and Hearing Association is the sort of parent organization that speech and language pathologists in the United States belong to. I believe that they have a membership. It was well over 150,000 a few years ago. It's probably in the 160s, maybe even 170,000. So it's kind of interesting to compare that organization in terms of its political influence and just its presence throughout the U.S. Compared to the number of behavior analysts that we have. We can go to the next slide. So what areas are most likely addressed of the areas I mentioned in children with an ASD diagnosis? We tend not to work really on voice problems, mostly speech and language, speech articulation, language, getting these kids to talk, and then feeding disorders as well. Primarily those are behavioral in nature when SLPs and behavior analysts work together with that. Next slide. If you need to find an SLP, you can call local school district, clinic, hospital, doctor. In the US, you can go to asha.org/profind. I recommend asking whether or not the SLP has any behavioral training. And I'll make a couple of points on some future slides about why I think that's so important. But basically, what we're looking for is an SLP whose perspective on language acquisition is from a functional point of view, that is Mann's, Tax, interverbals, echoics, and other verbal operants. We can go to the next slide. So there's a lot on this slide. I didn't want to animate it, so let's just kind of work through it from top to bottom. There are some strong discrepancies between the two fields of behavior analysis and speech and language pathology. And those strong discrepancies are in the area of theory, the theoretical and conceptual foundation for what we believe and why we believe it, as well as how we assess disorders. And then, of course, that would lead into how we treat those disorders. So let me just kind of run through some of these, and then I'll give you a reference in another slide of an article that I wrote with some colleagues that you might find helpful in further understanding some of these differences. Speech and language pathology from a theoretical conceptual perspective looks, their explanations are linguistic in nature, and they use structural terminology, structures like grammatical structures like nouns and verbs and so on. And so the explanations that are used for theoretical and conceptual understanding, the problem is that there's then kind of a roadblock because assessments are not going to yield anything in terms of an intervention. That is, there are no linguistic-based interventions that are available to speech and language pathologists. So what we have is a mismatch. We have an explanation that's very interesting. Certainly linguistics is a very interesting area. Structural explanations for language and how it might work. But then there is no intervention that follows from that theoretical basis and that conceptual understanding. And so speech and language pathologists look to other areas, primarily to behavior analysis, for treatments, reinforcement, prompting, fading, shaping, and things that speech pathologists have known about for years and years, and by and large have some skills that are very useful and successful in that area. Behavior analysis, on the other hand, our theoretical and conceptual explanations are based on observable environmental events. And we describe responses in terms of these environmental events. That is, responses as a function of antecedent and consequent environmental stimuli. And of course, then our interventions follow from that theoretical and conceptual basis such that we can continue to analyze during our assessments and during our intervention programs that we write. We write them based on what's happening antecedently and what's happening on the consequent side in terms of stimuli. There are some more and more, as I think you probably all know, speech pathologists that are becoming very interested in behavior analysis to the point they're becoming certified as BCBAs. And one that I wanted to draw your attention to is Dr. Gary Hegde. And I believe I may have spelled his name wrong, Hegde, I believe, not Hedge. But he is I do have it right on the second one. He is a professor emeritus from Fresno State University in California, speech pathologist by training. I would urge you to go to his website. It's a very useful website with lots of tools that you can use to understand speech pathology from a behavioral perspective. And in fact, last year we at ABA in Chicago, we had invited Dr. Hegde to come to the speech pathology SIG to give a talk about a new book that he has written and some work that he's been doing in India. But he was ill and wasn't able to come. So we'll try him again next year. Next slide. So the reference for this slide is down at the bottom, a paper that we published in 2010. And what we wanted to do, let me just kind of work you through this because I know there's a lot of words on here. We wanted to look at standardized speech and language assessments that SLPs give all the time. They may give them to the children that you work with. And because of this mismatch in how they tend to label disorders from a linguistic and a structuralist perspective, we often are not talking the same language as behavior analysts versus as speech pathologists. And so what we wanted to do was look at a variety of tests. We looked at 128, I believe, standardized speech and language tests, apraxia tests, aphasia tests, and articulation tests that speech pathologists give. And we recoded every item on all these tests according to Skinner's verbal operants and also according to receptive language, or what we would call listener responding. And so I wanted to show you this one because this is table 3, apraxia test. Apraxia is often a speech language diagnosis given to children with a diagnosis of autism if they're not speaking well, and sometimes if they're not speaking at all. And apraxia, kind of the short explanation for it for lay people, would be to describe a motor sequencing disorder without sensory loss. So there's nothing wrong with it. There's no paralysis in the mouth, and there's no hearing loss. There's no sensory loss. But for some reason, the child is having difficulty sequencing sounds. So you will note, let me just kind of draw your attention to the number of X's under the echoic column. And so what really apraxia tests are testing is the echoic repertoire. And so if you know that as a behavior analyst and as a speech pathologist, you can find some common ground in terms of not only the assessment, but how you're going to talk about the treatment. There are apraxia treatments. If you go to the next slide, you can see I've patched in this treatment called integral stimulation for apraxia problems. This is within the field of speech and language pathology. And what the person is told to do is watch me, listen to me, and say it with me. And so you can see that, okay, you have to have some receptive skills to respond to the SD watch me and listen to me. You have to obviously respond as a listener, but say it with me is requires an echoic repertoire. And so the treatment that a speech and language pathologist might call integral stimulation, a behavior analyst would call that treatment echoic, intensive echoic training. So we can go to the next slide. I think we missed a couple. Yeah, this is table 5, and I just wanted, if you could go back to table 5, just wanted to draw your attention to the different words that these disorders are called, like concepts and following directions is a listener skill. Word structure, the assessment of word structure is really a tact and an intraverbal assessment. The assessment, so if someone fails, for example, let's look at subtest 3, recalling sentences. If someone fails that, they might be labeled as a person that has recall difficulty, but we can see that what they really failed was to echo. And so you may find these tables useful for you as a kind of a translator for what are speech pathologists calling these problems, and what would a behavior analyst call those problems, and therefore how could we then address them. Next slide. This is just from the website behavioralspeech.com. Just wanted to draw your attention to the speech pathology applied behavior analysis special interest group that is affiliated with our behavior analytic international organization, ABAI. And that's all I have to say about that slide. We can go to the next one. This is from ASHA, from their policy statement on collaboration. So I just want to draw your attention to ASHA recognizes that it is within everybody's best interest to collaborate. However, when there are differences of opinion, it often comes down to whether or not the people that are having input about speech and language communication problems are indeed skilled to pass judgment about those problems, to assess those problems, to address those problems. And I think certainly within the area of behavior analysis, we have 30 or more years of research that we call verbal behavior research, but certainly falls within the purview of language and language expertise, where we find the biggest discrepancy in terms of people knowing what to do is with speech training. And I'll say a couple of things about that in another slide. We can go to the next one. So another question that Tina posed: under what circumstances will a child with autism benefit from SLP services, and what, if any, circumstances would there be where they wouldn't? In other words, what could an SLP do to address the needs of a child with autism? And certainly this is not an exhaustive list, but they have particular expertise in assessing vocalizations, vocal skills, phonetic skills, and in writing those in such a way phonetically that we can actually know where to go next. They also have information on those target topographies with respect to where do they fall within developmental models. Is this something that's normal? If a child is 4, for example, and can't say the J sound, the J sound, or the L sound, we wouldn't really be very concerned about it. And so sometimes we see a discrepancy between behavior analysts and speech pathologists, because behavior analysts aren't, if they don't have any training in sound development and speech and articulation and co-articulation training, then they have no basis on which to select appropriate targets. So speech and language pathologists can also help in writing shaping steps for the different syllables that we would address. I think that they should be trained and conversant with verbal behavior, so that whatever speech is being learned within the context of function, that is mands and tacts and so on. With respect to augmentative and alternative communication devices, speech pathologists certainly know how to assess the need for that, but the assessment also, again, should be function-based, and sometimes it is not. Sometimes it's linguistic-based. And so I think both professions, I think, can support one another in that discussion. And then they can also assist with tracking targets that we would describe as vocal targets, and then vocal verbal targets. In other words, vocal mands, vocal tacts, vocal interverbals, and so on. In the case of alternative communication, sign language or picture selection systems, it would be helpful if they could do the same thing when they're talking about language acquisition, whether it's vocal or non-vocal, that language acquisition be identified, taught, and tracked from a functional perspective. Next slide. And please stop me if the time is up, and we can wrap up and have questions. So just stop me anytime. I didn't have an answer for this question because I wasn't, maybe this will come up in Q&A. Do I have any practical tips on how behavior analysts can support care coordination with SLPs? I have a feeling that there are some specific instances about what exactly this question is getting at. So why don't we skip this one and maybe it'll come up in Q&A. If there are differing recommendations, for example, someone might recommend PECS, someone else might recommend sign. How can this be handled? Well, first of all, this comes up all the time, and it's not an easy decision. It's an even harder decision to sort of advocate for continuing to work on speech when it's not readily coming. Sometimes that takes several years. And of course, you do need a bridge in the meantime, either sign or picture selection. But in terms of how I would typically handle it, what I usually do is draw people's attention to the book written by Sundberg and Partington, published in '98, where they have a chapter, I believe it's chapter 4, on alternative and augmentative communication, and they have pros and cons of various systems. And so those should certainly be looked at. Also, other variables is whether or not there's training and support available for either one of those systems. You know, in terms of picture selection systems, many of those are now electronic based, and some of those systems can cost $10,000 or more. And so, and not everybody is trained to do that. On the other hand, one argument we hear is that not everybody is trained to read sign language. Usually, that's not very hard to stay 2 or 3 steps ahead of the learner with respect to sign. But the decision should be made based on the needs of the learner and not on the ease of the understanding of the listener. That should be less of a concern. And that brings me to the third bullet point. Picture selection is a stimulus selection procedure that requires conditional discrimination skills. Sign language does not require that 2-step discrimination process. It's like speech. And so if receptive skills of the learner don't include conditional discrimination skills, that would argue against them being ready for a picture selection system. And then I think the two fields need to come together to look at some literature about what works and what doesn't work. That's always changing and will continue to change. I was in another state once and asked someone why this child who was beginning to talk was going into this picture selection system, and the answer was, well, he's in the PECS classroom, and so he's got to communicate with PECS. And I had a similar experience where a child at snack time said, "Cookie, cookie please." And the teacher said, "Okay, you want a cookie, go get your PECS book and bring it back and give me the picture." And it just makes no sense whatsoever. Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure that Lori Frost would be the first one to agree with me that, you know, if you have a speaker, you certainly, that's effective, then what augmentative system really do they need if they're already able to have their vocal speech reinforced? So make sure the decision is based on the needs of the learner. Next slide. Wanted to draw your attention. How are we on time?
Yes, Dr. Esch, I was going to let you know we have about 10 minutes. And I think that the information you're providing is right on target with what the audience and participants was hoping to learn today. So I'd love to continue through the rest of your slides and then just spend a few minutes on questions.
Okay. I'll go into speed talk, which as a speech pathologist, I've been well trained to do. So when we get kids that come to us as behavior analysts or as speech pathologists, they usually fall into one of these 4 categories if they come to the attention of the speech pathologist. That is, for some reason, we're concerned about their speech and language. And this primarily, the first 2 skill areas is where there's no echoic skill at all, an inconsistent response to an echoic model. And then we get the group of kids that can talk somewhat. They're beginning to acquire vocal verbal behavior, some vocal mands and tacts, but they're not very clear. They're inarticulate. And I am very reluctant to put kids on AAC systems, whether they're sign or picture based. I'm not reluctant to do that as a bridge, but I'm reluctant to give up on working on speech because of these 4 areas. We want to make sure that we've taken a child to the highest level that we possibly can, and it doesn't matter how old they are. If they're 20 and they come to me and they're in group 1, then that's what we're going to work on. If they're 3 or 2 and they're in group 2 or group 3, then we simply move them into the next higher group of skills. But sometimes people will say, well, the child is 9 and you know, we've been working on speech for a long time and he still isn't talking, so should we give up on working on speech? And so I don't know whether you should or not. I would want to know how good has the echoic to mand, echoic to tact work and the transfer of those verbal operant skills. How accurate has that been? How intensive has it been? Have there been thousands and thousands of trials a day? Because we certainly know that typically developing kids will emit thousands of vocal verbal responses per day. And yet when we see programs being written for children with ASD, they might have speech from 9 o'clock to 9:15, and then they might address it again from 2:20 to 2:30 or whatever. My recommendation is it has to be sprinkled in thousands of times per day. And if that means 1 minute at the end of every 5 or if of instruction, then that's what it needs to be. Certainly, in my experience, children who have not yet learned to talk with a diagnosis of autism, very often the primary problem has been lack of intensive practice time. So we want to look at how much practice have they been receiving, how much speaking are they actually doing regardless of how old they are. Next slide. We can skip that one. And then I just had a few wrap-up slides that, and these are just common errors, and we might want to skip these and just go to Q&A. You've got a copy of them, and you're certainly welcome to look at those. But they were just several slides of typical problems that people, if they're not trained as a speech pathologist, what they tend to do wrong. I'm happy to run through them quickly if you want me to.
You know, why don't we run through them really quickly and then move to Q&A right after that?
Okay. So the next slide. I often see people say to the child, say, I want cookie, and the child can't say it. And so then they say I, good, say want, yes, say cookie, and then the child can do that. If the learner can't repeat the whole phrase, then the phrase is too long. And so what I tell people to do is to count syllables. When you write your targets, write them in terms of syllables, not in terms of words or in terms of phrases or sentences. So because that's what the breakdown looks like. And if you look at the ESA, group 1 is 1 and 2 syllables, group 2 is 2 syllables, group 3 is 3 syllables. And so what we want are fluent syllables, 3 syllables per second for normal speaking fluency. I'm speaking faster than that right now, but we don't want to slow the speaker down so that they get all the sounds right. Baby talk is okay. Misarticulations are just fine. We tolerate that with little kids that are learning to talk. Sometimes for 4 or 5 years, they still have a lisp, or they can't say their R's or their L's or whatever, or they still say flutterby instead of butterfly. And we tolerate that in favor of speed. And so this is a common error. I know this is not a training workshop for that, but be on the lookout for that. Next slide. I already talked about that one. We can skip that one. I often hear people who are not trained as speech pathologists giving an echoic model that's at an unnatural pitch. So they'll say the say part normally, and then they'll say the word they want the child to say at a too high pitch. So they might say bubbles, say hi, say cookie, like that. And so children will echo that or try to echo that often. Also, there's often behavior analysts don't know to not work on just consonants all by themselves. And speech pathologists rarely do that unless the learner is so sophisticated that they're cleaning up their articulation. But for early learners that aren't even talking very much yet, you have to have a vowel connected to a consonant because those are the building blocks for words. And so we wouldn't work on having a child just practice the M sound, for example, or the F sound. We wouldn't say, do this, candy. We would rather have them say, a-e, or something like that, so that we get the whole word or as much of the word as we can. We would not just practice consonants all by themselves for the really early speech learners. Next slide. I think this is the last one. I often see a echoic drill all by itself without a plan for manned application. And this often happens with speech pathologists and behavior analysts alike. And so I would always encourage people, if you're practicing something echoically, there should be a reason why. Where are you going to go with that skill and move it very quickly into something that you can reinforce as a manned? For children on that slide where there were 4 little boxes, and the first one was a child isn't really vocalizing very much, and the second was the child is echoing inconsistently. The first goal is to get a child to echo something, and I know legally Skinner wouldn't call that an echoic if it's not point to point, but when I say ah or say ba, I want you to say something, even if it's ooh or e, even if it doesn't match, and I would call that a non-matching echoic just among all of us. we want that to happen 100% of the time. And once they're echoing, even if it's imprecisely, 100% to 100% of the SD models, then we know that we can go in and shape the articulation and clean it up and so on through differential reinforcement. But without that, we're just kind of pushing a heavy box up a hill, you know. So that's one thing that is often an error that I see with behavior analysts who and speech pathologists alike. So together, I think both sets of skills, that is sound acquisition and language acquisition and differential reinforcement, shaping, all of that can come together to produce a very strong team. And that's all I have to say about the slides that I have today. We can just go to Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Haley, do you mind removing the slides from preview? Perfect. That was wonderful and I think was right on target. Thank you, Dr. Goldsmith, for sending those questions over as well. Our core learning theme for ECHO, autism, and applied behavior analysis is assessment of treatment barriers and addressing those through care coordination. So many of your questions that you went through, Dr. Esch, were right in line with what we were looking for. And that one particular question that you mentioned, us potentially having some specific questions regarding how to coordinate care with an SLP, I think was answered in previous slides with your table and how to transfer some of the language that a speech and language pathologist might be using into verbal behavior. I would love to open it up to see if we do have a couple of questions, but I'm very glad that we finished out your slides because I do think that the information you added, we would not have been able to get just from reading your slides. And so I thank you just quickly. Would anybody in the audience like to ask a quick question for Dr. Esch?
I have one.
Great. Go ahead, Kathy.
Hi. I wanted to see what your opinion was, or maybe some information when maybe we have a child who's using some kind of augmentative communication, be it PECS or a speech generating device, and their length of utterance is long and fairly complex. And then they do start to emit some of those vocal commands, so cookie please. So maybe they can say, you know, I want the big round cookie with their device, and they can just say cookie with vocal speech. When do we start, I guess, when do we start to say, okay, I'm going to switch for that. It's vocal speech, let's go for that, versus they have a more, you know, complex form of speech with something else?
My professional preference is vocal speech, even if that means that the vocal speech is less complex. In general, because if I have vocal speech that's at the point that it can be reinforced, what I've found is that it's simply a matter of increasing syllable length skill, that is fluency, emitting more syllables. And often that's where the breakdown occurs. And so, you know, we know that as behavior analysts that are really good at differentially reinforcing different functions of speech, it shouldn't be that difficult to coordinate that with different linguistic parts of speech, like noun verbs and getting prepositions and prepositional phrases and all the little words like the and all of that in there. But those are less powerful than certainly, you know, nouns and verbs. And so I would opt to reinforce as much vocal speech as possible. And I have never seen a child with a really wide discrepancy, and maybe you have, in terms of, like, I've never seen a child that could encode lengthy, linguistically complex sentences on a PECS system or on an electronic system and only be able to say cookie. You know, it just is, I just haven't seen it, although that's not to say that it doesn't exist. So I tend to want to put my eggs in the basket of speech acquisition and have, as I said earlier, usually found that the reason children haven't acquired it, at least for most of the kids that I've seen, is it's not addressed enough of the day. It's just not intense enough. That doesn't mean, though, that there certainly are not children with ASD that will probably not ever talk and that absolutely do need some sort of an augmentative system. In the case of kids that, kind of have a little bit of both, my recommendation would be to continue to reinforce the function of the utterance, whether it's vocal or non-vocal, but verbal. So I'm, very comfortable reinforcing both of those. If sometimes you want to ask with your AAC device, or sometimes you want to ask with your voice. If both of those can be reinforced, I don't have any problem with that. What we often see, though, is kind of a melting of the MO for using the AAC when the vocal becomes powerful. That is when the child learns, oh, when I open my mouth, people actually are responding in a way that, improves my life. That is differential reinforcement. And so then they tend to kind of take off in that direction.
Excellent question, Kathy. I don't know, Dr. Esch, if you're able to see the chat box, but we have comments coming through just mentioning how informative your presentation was, and I think that the majority of the participants in the audience are wishing that you were on their team so that they could consult with you on a consistent basis. But we just thank you so much for your time today. It was an excellent presentation, exactly what we were looking for, and I do wish that we had more time so to ask additional questions. Part of ECHO is we actually combine didactic presentations with case presentations, and so the next part of our ECHO clinic today is we have two individuals that are working in the school district, and they're going to be presenting a case for the audience and our panelists, and we'll be troubleshooting and providing them with some recommendations. So we'll be moving on to that piece next, and great, and I see that we have the case presentation form. So Cosette and Morgan, welcome, and please feel free to begin whenever you are ready.
Hi everyone, I'm Cosette Montañez, and I'm very excited to present this case. It's a case that we've been dealing with for some time, and we're hoping to get some input, opinions, insight on where to go next. So let me just start by giving a little bit of background. This is a 9-year-old girl that was diagnosed before the age of 3 with autism. And throughout the years that we've had her in the district, we've had difficulties with behavior, mostly aggression towards others, sometimes towards self. But last year, she stopped talking in the school setting. And she has now been diagnosed with selective mutism as well. So that is the challenge that we have, is addressing that behavior, because as we see, as we go through the presentation, you'll see that the other behaviors that she had decreased and the failure to speak increased. And so we don't know where to go next, and we really need some ideas on what to do. So let me see. One of the things we really want to do is to have her, again, use her speech in the classroom setting as she has in the past, and as she does in other environments. And she actually will speak with staff and peers outside of the school setting, but not in the school setting. Even individuals that she had spoken to in the past, and that was, she was fairly close to, she stopped talking to. The other thing that has happened now that she has the additional diagnosis of selective mutism is that the speech language services were terminated, and it was decided based on evaluation that because so that the mutism was more related to a mental health disorder, that the speech services would not address those issues. Not everyone on her team agrees with that, but it is something that was, done based on the testing that was done last spring. So we're missing our SOP as part of her team. Right now, she just receives school mental health services to address the social skills. And we also discussed her case in our technical autism assistance team to try to come up with ideas on how to help her. And we also have our autism instruction specialist, Morgan, here helping the classroom teacher and other staff that work with her in addressing this. But we probably need more. We're not sure if some of the things that we're doing are the right thing to do. So we definitely need input from anyone who, who maybe has some experience with this or has thought of things we haven't thought of yet. So our goals for her specifically are to, have her speak in the classroom setting, one-on-one situation, small group. As she had before, she was a child that had, or in other settings and in the past, had full sentences. Still, limited in her initiation of interaction with others, consistent with her autism, but she still, if she used language, she had full sentences and continues to do so in other settings. I want to now kind of have Morgan explain the services, the setting that she's in, the curriculum that the classroom follows, so that you get an idea of some of the things that we're doing with her to address the issues.
So this student is currently placed in an autism-specific classroom, and we use a curriculum called STARS. It's Strategies for Teaching Based on Autism Research. It's grounded in ABA therapy. We do discrete trial for language acquisition, receptive, expressive. We use PRT for also building on language, and then also classroom routines, teaching a child how to function independently within their school day. So that's what we've been using, and with success, she has learned a lot of social skills that she didn't have prior to using the curriculum. So that's what we've been doing in terms of teaching social skills. But as Cosette stated, we noticed that as she started acquiring all these skills, she stopped talking as much. So we are then becoming just really concerned. Everyone's really happy that she's not physically aggressive. She's extremely happy, and everyone just enjoys being around her. But she prefers to write everything down. And she has a journal and a notebook, and she likes drawing pictures, and she will draw pictures with little bubbles. And whatever she wants to communicate, she prefers to do it by writing it down. We've used a picture exchange communication system to build on those sentences. Like Cosette says, we know that she knows how to, but again, we're just trying to build on her utterances in school. So we're using PECS and then asking her to point to a picture that she would like to say. And she would wait us out sometimes an hour, 2 hours, and then we were having the discussion. Well, now it's impacting her education because now she's not going to classes because we're waiting her out for her to say a word. And this was all done in April. So starting the school year, we just started last week, and she's doing great in terms of attending general education classes. She's forming friends, and we want to know, do we continue with waiting her out using PECS, and also kind of a PRT technique. After PE, we'll block the water fountain and have her say water. So sometimes that works, sometimes she just walks away. And again, we just starting this school year, we want to know what direction to take because she does really well with the writing and all those social skills are improving, but we feel like it's a balance that with one skill she learns, then another will go away. So yeah, and this is kind of the verbal communication. So the preferred items, like I stated, the only time we could really ever get anything was the water after PE, setting up that situation, and then seldomly during breakfast, having her use the PEC system and say, I want drink please, and her identifying one word that she would like to say. So sometimes it would be I or please, but that was very seldom and required a lot of time delay. So we just put down just her past behaviors, non-compliance, eloping, physical aggression, SID, self-injurious behavior. Like this has been a concern since she was in DD pre, and now we're not seeing any of those past behaviors. The only one we're really seeing now is this selective mutism. And then, so this is where I struggle doing an FBA because it gets like dead man rule that there's no frequency, there's no duration, no intensity because she's just not talking, and I can't reinforce if she's not making utterances other than those few times that we got her to say something in April but not May. And then we presume that the function is social negative because that's what we concluded in the past, that she likes to escape social demands. Anytime asking her to share in class, working with other kids. So anytime we put a social demand, we would see those aggressive behaviors. And now she tolerates it and is enjoying it, but now we notice that we just hypothesize that maybe there's some correlation that she's not talking due to that social negative, that she wants to escape the social demand. So this is just the intervention from last year. So it's school days down here, August, September, November. So you can see how it significantly decreased. And then I just presented the problem that I don't know how to determine the function of this behavior with not having a behavior that I can measure. And then I've already stated that we use PRT, social skills training, functional communication training, PECs. So right now we're working on, like I said, we've been in school for a week and a half. So we're accepting gestures. She'll point to something, head nods. We ask yes, no questions. She'll show us items. And then verbal communication. So we invite her to talk by saying, will you tell me? Or when she shows us saying, oh, what is that? And always trying to encourage that verbal, but I think through my data you'll see that it's 0. Anytime we ask her to say anything, but she prefers this writing in a journal to request, to comment. Right now she's into comic books and she's writing everything in relation to a comic book. Yeah, and this is a show me, tell me, so that's how we're measuring that we're inviting her to use verbal, but she is denying to use verbal, and that's the graph. So verbal is 0. Out of every opportunity we present, 0 responses, and every opportunity we present to have nonverbal communication, and then here's the written communication, and we invite her to write it down, and she naturally goes to that. But I had the pleasure of having her in science camp this summer in July, and I was measuring greetings, verbal. This is all verbal. So her going up and greeting an adult and a peer, having conversations with peers, tracking the talker, meaning looking at whoever is talking, following directions, and then asking questions when she didn't understand something. So you can see that she received really high marks. very talkative, very making a lot of comments about explosions that were going on and how the GAC smelled. So one question I asked, just to give you an example, I said, what type of rock is that? And she said, sedimentary. I said, well, how do you know? And she said, because it's the line. So you can see from that example that she does have good language and can have those conversations, but I've been working with her for the last week and she won't talk to me, but she talked with me a lot during the summer. So I'm trying to understand why she's choosing not to talk in a school that she's been at since DD Pre. And I have video footage. So one intervention Cosette and I have been researching is using the videos and recreating the situation and encouraging her to use the same verbal language that she used in the video. So that's just one thing we wanted to try. But again, we are waiting for this presentation to know how to move forward. This is just last April when we were blocking access, trying to get her to talk. And then the family, do you want to?
Yes. So one of the things we've worked on throughout the years is try to have the family access outside services. And that's been challenging. And we understand she comes from a family with siblings that are diagnosed with other disorders, and it is a single mom. So we understand it would be difficult to coordinate services with, so many children having such high needs. But we really do feel that if we could get those outside services, we would see a lot of improvement at school and probably in the home setting. So we want to know how to better approach mom to encourage her to seek these services. It's difficult when you're in a school setting to make those kind of recommendations. You can just suggest them, but it really is up to the parent to follow through. The other thing as well in accessing these services is that she would need, under the new regulations that we have in this state, she needs an approved evaluator to conduct the evaluation to give her the diagnosis so that she can access these services. And we do have a long waiting list in the state. They have a preference for younger children under the age of 5. And then, children that are older will wait longer. And it's not just the wait for the evaluation, it's also the wait to get the ABA services if they do qualify. So I think that in a nutshell is the summary of our case. We didn't go through every detail. If you want us to go back and specify anything that we've stated or give more information, please let us know.
You did a wonderful job, Cosette and Morgan. Thank you for taking the time to review the case. I'll just summarize it briefly in a couple of sentences, and then we'll move on to clarifying questions. But we have Cosette and Morgan that are presenting on a 9-year-old girl diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and within the last year, she was diagnosed with selective mutism. She has been receiving services in the school setting in a autism-specific classroom and has demonstrated some great progress, it sounds like, and in the last year it's been noted that she has been not speaking specifically in the school setting. However, you have parent reports and observations of her not only initiating and responding to language in other settings such as the home and science camp. So the presenting questions are, with all of this great information that you're presenting today, what would be some appropriate next steps of intervention so that she is still accessing her educational curriculum in the classroom, but then also potentially how can the parents be approached about potential services that they might benefit from or that she might benefit from outside of the school setting as well, and how that might be communicated to the family. Did I capture the primary areas correctly?
Yeah, that was perfect.
Okay, perfect. So we have time for just 1 or 2 questions from our audience members before we move on to our panelists. So does anybody in the audience have a question, a clarifying question at this time that they would like to ask for Cosette and Morgan? And then we will get to recommendations after that.
I do. I have a quick question. This is Dan.
Super.
I understand that she was exhibiting aggressive behavior while at the same time that she was talking previously, and I just wanted to ask if those two behaviors changed at almost the same time, whether she stopped talking and stopped aggressing at about the same time, according to the data.
Yes, I mean, there are some blurred lines, like she never, let me clarify. So she's always felt a little uncomfortable talking at school. She would use one-word utterances, and out in the community she would use full sentences. But if she was very familiar with the staff, she would talk full sentences, tell you stories. And then last year when we started doing the intervention, yes, she started saying less and less. And as her behaviors decreased, we noticed a direct correlation that she stopped talking.
Okay.
I had a question.
Oh, go ahead.
I just had a question about, in terms of deprivation, how does she get her needs met? I know that you mentioned she writes or whatnot, but how does she get her needs met in general?
Writing. She prefers writing in her journal.
And she gestures.
Yeah, she gestures, she points, head nods. So we'll say, are you ready to go to language arts class? And she'll nod, yes. But mostly writing. So she'll write down, I want to go wherever, I want whatever. So she prefers to use writing as her form of communication to meet her needs.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Hector and Dan, for your questions. So we might have some additional time, but I do want to make sure that we just move through so that we get to the most important part at the end, which will be the recommendations. So we're going to move on to our panelist questions. And so I think I'll just ask, Dr. Soul, would you like to ask a question, go first?
Sure, absolutely. Well, again, outstanding job. Really great case presentation and very, very interesting. It's incredibly tricky to address selective mutism, and so I think you guys have done a really nice job of trying to address that along, and especially with the context that you guys have discussed already. So I don't know that I have a ton of questions. One thing I do have, I'm curious, does she seem like she's anxious? Does she seem like she's fearful? Any of those types of issues?
Yes.
Okay. I know you touched on that some, but can you give me a specific example of a time that you thought that, wow, she really looks anxious, fearful, etc.?
It was, I guess it was better seen when she had the physical aggression, because she would scream and just her facial expressions looked like fear, like asking her to share a turn, like doing a simple my turn, your turn task. She would run away, and it looked like she had a lot of anxiety just to do what we thought was a simple task that she should be able to do. But now, like I said, she seems a lot happier, and we're not pushing her to those anxiety moments because we're accepting the writing currently. So I don't see it with the selective mutism anxiety, but in the past, yes, screaming and facial.
Okay. And so I guess, thank you for that clarification, because I knew that she clearly had anxiety issues around, or, fear-based issues when she was being aggressive, and I was just curious if she's still, and you answered that, so thank you. So it sounds like she's much less now that everyone else has kind of backed off. What about, can you give me a little bit more detail possibly about her home. You know, you mentioned the single mom, several other siblings with, you know, additional needs. Does she have is there structure at home? Does she have a routine at home? Does she have very many kind of like requirements by her mom at home, or is it more or less she gets to do what she wants?
We suspect that a lot of this is reinforced. To give you an example, in the past, mom was called when she would have these aggressive outbursts because they were happening on a daily basis, pretty extreme, sometimes injuring staff. So they would call mom, and mom would come with some, you know, donuts or something,
toys,
or take her home to McDonald's. So it was pretty soon. You saw an increase in daily, you know, aggressive behavior, and in her verbalizing that she wanted to go home. And the same thing with the not talking. When staff members have seen her outside of the school setting, she will talk to them, and sometimes mom will comment, "It's okay, you can talk, you're not in school." So there's reinforcing of a lot of her behaviors, and so I'm imagining it's being a single parent to these 3 children. It would be hard to have a regular routine, and just a lot of things would be so difficult. So that we don't know exactly, but that's what we, you know, we think is going on.
Okay. And then one more clarifying question. Thank you. That response was very helpful. Do you think mom would be receptive to kind of trying to make home life a little bit more structured, and or do you think she'd be receptive to working with her to see kind of some of the reinforcers that she's maybe inadvertently doing? I don't know. I'm just curious about what that looks like.
Yes, since it's been so many years and it's been, you know, addressed at meetings, and it hasn't been followed through, it doesn't look that way. But I think maybe if others that were maybe outside of the school setting could address it, that might help. It's just because it's coming from the school, and we're limited in how we even say or recommend things that have to do with outside services.
True.
We can't be so direct, I guess.
She's received outside services and pretty much told them she would dismiss them. Even her relative, she has a relative that's BCBA, right?
No.
But a specialist in behavior, and a teacher, and she would try to give her advice and help her, and mother also denied that support. So, and even with what we did at school, like Cosette said, we would call and mom would show up with donuts and things, and so we just, to solve that problem, we just stopped calling mom during those times and just handled it within the school. But we did let her know, like, our system saying, well, if she does something correct, then she gets something, but if, you know, she hurts someone, then she doesn't get access to those things.
Good.
Mhm. Great.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Tina, would you like to go next with clarifying questions?
Sure. Hi, again, I'm Tina, and I'm a psychologist and a behavior analyst. So I was wondering if you could speak to who diagnosed her with selective mutism, and if that was a diagnosis rendered by an external, somebody, you know, external to the school, psychologist, and what, if any, recommendations for intervention they made, and what collaboration you guys have fostered.
It was actually another psychologist in the district. I think at that time there was even debate as to whether autism was an appropriate diagnosis, and finally decided that, you know, they would just add the selective mutism. So the recommendations made by the psychologists are really school-based, you know, continuing with the mental health services that she receives here, the social skills training, those kinds of things, but not anything for outside services. And again, because we're in this setting, we always have to be very careful about that, unfortunately. But that's why I had said that she really does need an evaluation from one of the autism approved or an approved evaluator, so that she can access those outside services, and that's what we would like for her to get, because that would help, for services out there.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think we'll circle back to that in the recommendation section, sort of, who would be the right service provider if the family did open up to seeking external services for this little girl. You mentioned that her speech is pretty strong and she's talking in full sentences in other contexts, but could you elaborate on that a little bit more for me? And in particular, I'm asking because selective mutism is an anxiety disorder, right? So this is a girl who has anxiety. She has an anxiety disorder that happens to be selective mutism. I'm curious about what other anxiety may sort of be coupled with that for her. And it wouldn't be unreasonable for her to carry both diagnoses. It's not common, but it certainly, those diagnoses could co-occur. But in treatment of anxiety, even for kids with autism, those treatments are behavioral, but tend to be a little bit more CBT focused, which rely to some degree on language skills to support the success of those interventions. So I'm just curious about if not only she has full sentence speech, but can she use that in the context of conversational exchanges? Can she track her own emotions? Can she identify situations that cause her to feel a little bit more anxious than others? Because her skill level could help me better understand what specific treatments may be beneficial for her.
Yeah, like kind of the example I gave about asking her about the rocks, like she can go back and forth. Conversation she actually enjoys engaging in. You asked, like recalling events. She loves telling about going to zoos and different events that her family goes out and does out in the community. Labeling her emotions have been something that the mental health has always worked on since she was really little. But typically when I see her in the community, she's happy, and we can ask her like, hey, how do you feel? She's like, oh, I feel great. And she's just, it's like she's a different person now in the community. But then at the school setting, when she was aggressive, we would try labeling, like, I see you're angry, let's take a break, ask for a break, and we try to help her label it, but she wouldn't really identify the emotions, but she would ask for the break. That was successful, that she was able to ask for a break, and now she can do that independently and help to identify. But again, like I said, I don't feel like she's having a lot of mixed emotions that we saw in the past because we're allowing the writing, and she just overall seems, I don't know the word, but she seems more in control of her emotions.
But she has been able to verbalize that she doesn't speak at school because it's embarrassing. Outside of the school setting, she has said that. So she has, the ability to describe it.
Tina, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I think somebody else muted me. I'm on the phone, but so I'm back. So thank you so much. I think that's extraordinarily helpful information for me to have as I try to conceptualize this case. I have about a dozen more questions. I'm going to ask one more, though, because I want to turn it over to somebody else. But can you speak just a little bit about her peer relationships, the quality of them? Does she have a friend or friends, and has the quality of her peer relationships shifted as her problem behavior has reduced and as her functional language use at school has decreased?
Well, she's always gravitated. She's in a classroom with multi-age classroom, so she's gravitated to the younger children, and she had one in particular that she, interacted most with, but it was the kind of thing where I tell you what to do, and this child just, applied and followed, and so they got along because of that. And even with this child that she interacted so frequently, communication or speaking to him has also, it's not there. So it's not just with staff, it's with people that she actually interacted on a frequent basis.
And even she has a twin sister, and they're really good friends. Again, referring back to science camp, when the sister would show up with mom to pick her up, she's like, "What you do?" And she'd say, "Oh, we had a volcano that exploded." So they would have this back and forth. But then I saw the sister, we ran into each other in the hall, and I was really closely watching to see how the student would respond to with her twin sister, and she just waved and smiled at her sister and walked on. So she didn't stop. And then last year she had a friend that she liked doing recess with, and that's how we encouraged her to go out into the general education population, because we were like, "Oh, she's going to be there and she wants you to," but I think Jose kind of, she tends to pick kids that are quiet, that she can kind of tell them what to do, and just very compliant kids.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you so much for adding that information. Super helpful. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Zoe, would you like to go next?
Sure, Joy, thank you. Again, I'm Zoe Miguel, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker here in Santa Fe. Great presentation, very interesting. And I've actually worked with a couple of kids who had selective mutism, and so I'm particularly interested in Tina with her background, what her recommendations will be. I have a couple of quick questions. Were there any events at school that occurred around the time that she stopped talking?
Well, I think, we've tried to figure that out. I think that in dealing with her aggressive behavior, the team at the time may have been using CPI on a frequent basis, and I think that probably did not help her how she felt in the school environment, because her aggression was severe on a daily basis, that at least one staff member was having to restrain her, and I'm sure that over time that just really became very traumatic for her. So we thought that could be a reason, and then then she stopped the aggression, or the aggression decreased, and then the lack of speech increased.
Yeah, when I first came in like 3 years ago, she was being extremely physical aggressive, and staff were holding her, doing a lot of restraints, and that was like in March, and then we had another year, and the staff continued to use CPI. And there's a lot of discussion because she was so aggressive, and I collected my data and I showed them, I said, "Look, we're increasing the behavior. We have to stop this." So last year we finally got a teacher that was really willing to not use those physical restraints, and that's when we started to see the decrease in physical aggression. But I also, part of me, I don't know if I reinforced this writing thing, because she was talking less and she was wanting to write on the journal. So we just started accepting that, because we noticed that she wasn't being so physically aggressive and she could have her needs met that way. So I was, one of my fears is that I accidentally reinforced the journal writing during that time, because we noticed a direct accepting the journal writing, and then the behaviors went down, the physical aggression. So that's what I didn't know if that was the right intervention. And looking to the future, do we continue to accept the journal writing, or do we encourage the verbal?
Right. Great. That's super helpful. Let's see. So I missed, you said that she had expressed to you something about why she wasn't talking at school, and I'm afraid that my audio dropped out just at that moment. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that.
He has said outside of the school setting that she doesn't talk in school because it's embarrassing. And that, that's the level of her explanation. So
Yeah.
that's what she has verbalized. And I think she's verbalized, sometimes it's because of teacher.
Which is the positive teacher that we have in there now. He's a male. I don't know if Chris has talked about, like, mom doesn't have a consistent father figure. She has boyfriends that come and go. So we're like, is that something that's related, that he's a man? But for her to say that it's him, like, we're trying to understand. We're like, probably the nicest teacher you've had, so we're just trying to understand. But even I asked her during science camp, I said, oh man, I love how you're talking. We were reviewing the data. I was showing her the graph, how well she was doing. I said, why don't you talk like this at the school? And she said, Mr. So-and-so. And I said, why? And she just shrugged her shoulder. I don't know. And just kind of walked off. So I didn't push the issue. And so I feel bad, like, telling that story because the teacher is just so wonderful. But
no, it actually is. I don't feel bad at all. It actually could be very, very helpful information. So has this teacher been with her? Was this her teacher last year?
Yes, and currently.
Okay. And did those two coincide? When she got a male teacher, did her aggressive behavior go down and her language go down? Did those coincide at all?
Yes.
Yeah. And how old is she again?
9.
9. Okay. Let's see what else. And just a quick question about mom. So have you asked mom what her thoughts are about her daughter sort of speaking at school and not speaking at school? Have you been able to have a conversation with her about that?
Yeah, and she says it's the teacher. She said, well, I asked her, and she said that it's Mr. So-and-so, so that must be it. So,
Okay.
Which we're like,
Great.
yeah.
That's really helpful. I think sometimes just sort of brainstorming a bit about environmental factors, and especially as Dr. Goldsmith said, that selective mutism is an anxiety disorder. And so just talking about all the different pieces that might be affecting that increase anxiety for her is super helpful. So again, I'm going to pass on to the other hub members. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Kathleen.
I do not have any questions, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to Cosette and Morgan, both. This is the type of collaboration that we strive to have with our school districts, and so it's really exciting for us to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah Baca, from a parent's perspective, and I just lost her on the screen. Oh, there you are, Sarah, sorry. From a parent's perspective, do you have any questions for Morgan and Cosette regarding the child?
I don't have very many questions, and I want to get onto the recommendations because I know we're running short on time. But I just want to thank you guys for your commitment to this little girl and her family, and helping her, to be the best that she can be. And so from a parent, it's always heartwarming to hear teachers, do what you guys are doing to help her. So thank you for that. And I'm sitting here trying to think about, what could be going through the mom's head. I guess I'm curious, whenever she got that second diagnosis, did that change anything with the mom, or I'm trying to wrap everything around my head, really, and I'm just, I'm kind of at a loss, but did that change anything?
She didn't seem shocked by it. When I was there, she just was like, okay. She's just, her personality, she's just very go with the flow, like, okay, oh yeah. When the SLP said that she's no longer going to receive speech services, she was like, okay. And I'm like, I was like, no, she didn't express any emotions that getting that second diagnosis, how that affected how she viewed her child and her child's education and what that would change in their lives.
Okay. Yeah. I guess I'll have some recommendations in the recommendation part about maybe trying to get her engaged with other families somehow. Just because I think that if she could do that, meeting the other parents is amazing. But hopefully we can come up with some recommendations to get that happening and engaged in the community. So that way then she can help her daughter. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Morgan and Cosette, wonderful job. I had a couple of just additional clarifying questions as I'm thinking about your hypothesized function and actually some of the comments that I see coming through too regarding the writing and the replacement behavior and what some of those consequences might be in the school and how it might differ as well from the community and home environment. So one of the questions that I had is, Morgan, you had mentioned reinforcing the writing, which I think that most of us would have done as well. I think that that was an appropriate step at the time, and I would not beat yourself up about reinforcing an appropriate replacement behavior while you're trying to reduce the aggression. One question that I had is, in reinforcing the writing versus reinforcing vocal language, have you put in any differential reinforcement procedures when you are working with her for the two different man topographies?
Meaning like still encouraging that verbal communication?
Yes, and so potentially if she's requesting, let's say, escape, maybe she's getting a longer, more enriched break if she requests verbally or vocally versus if she requests in writing, she might get a shorter break that doesn't have as many preferred activities incorporated.
Yeah, so again, I guess I'm stuck because she's not really verbalizing. So the only way we get anything really verbal out of her is by blocking the access after PE, like I stated in the PECs. But also, she's just so much more compliant than before, like the breaks. Like she used to have to ask for breaks very frequently, and now, like I stated, she's going into her general education classes. She can do the work for long periods of time, so she's not needing to ask for those breaks. She's working independently, which was a huge goal for us. So I'm finding it hard to identify those opportunities. But, the written thing, she likes, with the writing, she likes commenting more than anything. Like she really likes like Powder Puff Girls, so she'll have her Powder Puff Girls and she has little thought bubbles or talking bubbles, and she wants us to read it in the comic books, and so it's more about commenting about what's going on, and then so.
Oh, great. Okay. No, that's very, very useful information, especially looking at what might be motivating to her as well at the time too. And so Powderpuff Girls, great. And trying to get an idea of her classroom environment versus the science camp, I was curious if you could share a little bit about how many students are present in her classroom versus the ratio at science camp as well.
That's a great question. So at science camp, there were 10 students, typically developing only one other student with autism who also attends the same elementary school that she goes to. And then her general education class, I'd say like 23 is a rough estimate, something like in the 20s. And then she still attends the self-contained class for the last portion of the day, and there are 6 kids with autism in that class, and she's also doing well in that class.
Okay, great. And then just to clarify, she is not engaging in any vocal language in either the gen ed class or the special education class.
Correct.
Great. And then when you were working with her, you mentioned that you were able to get quite a bit of language out of her during science camp. When you were working with her in the school, are you working with her in these group settings? And the reason why I'm asking is because she had mentioned being embarrassed in front of her peers. And I'm curious if you've been able to entice any language out of her in a one-on-one setting, but still while at the school.
No, I haven't done the one-on-one. I'm actually paired with another kid in the class, so I've just been interacting with her within that class when she comes and on the recess, on the playground. But she's no longer the focus of my attention because we have other students who are physically aggressive. But in advising the staff, I wanted to know where to go forward. That's why we are consulting with you all. So.
Okay, perfect. No, and I think that that's excellent. And that is great information because it just gives us a better idea of what those environmental factors might be as we're trying to identify those antecedents, and including, you know, who's present in the classroom. And so my very, very last question is, because her language has just reduced down so significantly in the school, if mom is present in the school setting, is she able to get any vocal language from her at that point either?
No.
No. Okay. Great. All right. So let's go ahead and move on to our recommendations. We have, I'm looking at the time, not a lot of time. So what I would love to do is to get our wonderful audience recommendations in the chat box so that we can include them in our written recommendations to Morgan and to Cosette. And then let's go ahead and move on to our panelist recommendations so we can get through everything today. So moving through, let's start with Tina, actually. Dr. Goldsmith, if you would like to begin. Oh, and I think you're muted. No, can't hear you.
I don't know. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Okay,
I think Haley's muting me and unmuting me. So thank you, Haley. So I think to start, my recommendation would be to reframe a little. And I think this is tricky to do, but I would try to hold on to this notion that talking means that she's feeling okay in her body, right? Like in its most simple way to conceptualize it. And not talking means that she's not feeling okay in her body. So as you think about what your goal is for treatment, which also links to the way you're conceptualizing the FBA and some of these other pieces, your goal is really to make her feel okay in her body, not to get her to talk. Because if you get her to feel okay in her body, the talking is going to come. So this really is developing an intervention to treat her anxiety. And I know that we could talk about this in very complex behavioral terms, so I'm just trying to be simple in a way. So, you know, I think just kind of hold on to that conceptualization and it'll kind of shift your recs a little bit differently. You know, with regards to sort of specific treatment components, you asked earlier about do we wait her out? And I would say no. That, you know, that because this is an anxiety disorder, putting increased pressure to perform in this way when her anxiety is already up could further increase her anxiety. And like you said, you could be caught, like you could be trapped there forever and you're sort of pulling her anxiety up rather than driving it down, right? Your goal is not to get her to talk, but to feel better in her body. So if your goal is to get her to feel better in her body, you wouldn't wait her out, right? So just hold on the conceptualization, will drive the recs differently. But I think you would want to differentially reinforce, right? So it's not that you wouldn't want to take one versus the other, right? Written in her journal versus spoken language. You want to reinforce both. It's just that you want to try to reinforce differentially so that you really get the response of the nature that you want. So hopefully that answers the one question that you posed. I think with regards to the peer relationships, the other recommendation I would make for her and for any kid in the situation is just that those peer dynamics can be really important and can, you know, again, make her feel really great in her body or cause her anxiety to come up a bit. And so I think anything that you can do to structure those peer relationships to be maximally supportive for her is spot on. So think about ways that she may be able to engage with her peers across her day that in a way that doesn't require verbal performance. So and you may already be doing this, and it's so great. Just keep on keeping on. But if there's a game time for free play activity on a school day, don't play Zingo, right? Play charades instead. So that will allow her to feel confident and to still maintain those relationships so that peers aren't pulling away from her at the exact moment you're wanting them to be maximally supportive of her, right? And that may end up sort of shifting into a more specific recommendation around sort of a peer buddy and support, with those people being ideally selected, right? The quiet kids, the kids who are going to have lower expectations for social performance and language sophistication. So I think you're right to be thinking about peers. Just keep thinking about how to foster that. I think my biggest rec is this kid sounds like a kid who needs help outside of school, and I know that that's tricky because you can only say so much and push so much, but the nature of selective mutism is such that the kids who encounter the best success are usually those kids whose parents are seeking CBT services for them outside of school, fostering a strong school partnership, and also getting family therapy services to boot, right? Part of the reason is because this kid's social world is so big and complex. Other kids in the family with diagnoses, which we didn't get into. We also know anxiety runs in the family. So CBT coupled with family therapy, coupled with strong school collaboration is probably the way to go. And just as another way to emphasize that, you're talking about getting an autism evaluation provider to give a diagnosis to give access to ABA services. And I think you definitely want to do that. But I think she already has a selective mutism diagnosis. If a medical provider also gives the same diagnosis, which it sounds like they will, she should be able to access those services. Does that make sense? The AEP diagnosis is only linked to ABA services. But this is a kid who, yes, needs ABA, but needs CBT family therapy and can get those services under her existing selective mutism diagnosis. So there shouldn't be an access to treatment barrier that relates to that piece. So just keep that in mind. And I think keep it up with allowing for alternative means of communication. That's spot on. And for the video modeling thing, I think give it a try. I think there's, as you guys said, you're researching it. There's not a ton of research on this, particularly with video modeling with autism, with selective mutism, but there's a little bit. So, it can't hurt. And I think it could be fun and engaging for her. And certainly if it's blended in a larger intervention, for her, I think it could be a great technique. So I'm going to pass it, and I hope that I talked fast enough to not eat up all of our time. But great case, very fascinating.
Morgan has a quick question for you, Tina.
Oh yeah, go for it.
I don't know how to reinforce when there's no verbal. Like I stated before, the only way we can get verbal is that waiting out technique. And like you said, I felt extremely uncomfortable because I could see her anxiety going up. So that's when I put a stop to it in April. It's like, you know what, let's just hold off on that. Because I was I didn't feel right about it.
I think your intervention, conceptually your intervention in 2 phases, right? Like phase 1, make her feel good in her body, right? Yeah. And during that phase, in the beginning, you will have nothing to differentially reinforce because she's not going to give you anything, right? But if that phase of your intervention is effectively designed and her anxiety decreases, over time you'll see an increase. So I say take the pressure off yourself and take the pressure off of her to get her to talk. And when it happens, be ready to differentially reinforce. But just know, and I think be okay with the fact that it may take some time for her to get there, right? It's a big thing for her. And, and just as a caveat, you said she seems really happy at other times, but people who seem seemingly happy can also be really uncomfortable internally. And I know that maybe doesn't sound so behavioral, but that's the reality of it. And so I think don't be too quick to think that external presentation, her affect, is necessarily indicative of how she's feeling internally. But yeah, take the pressure off of you to make her talk, to have something to differentially reinforce, and just sort of let that come and then be poised to spring into action with the differential reinforcement when the vocal verbal behavior does come out,
That's great. Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Yes, and just to piggyback off of that a little bit, and thinking about making her feel okay in her body, trying to recreate maybe some of the environmental conditions that she does feel comfortable when she's not in that school setting. And so if it is the presence of other peers, is there a peer that maybe, can you reduce the number of peers that she's around? And so I know that you have other contingencies in place where you need to work with other children while you're there. So maybe it's being creative with a classroom environment and trying to pull her off to the side so that she can feel a little safer and when you are engaging in interactions with her, rather than the goal being trying to get her to talk, as Dr. Goldsmith is mentioning, is thinking about those really highly preferred activities. Arlette actually put a comment in there too. Is it the Powder Puff Girls that you were saying that she really enjoys? And so maybe it could be, if she's really wanting, she's commenting. And so maybe really what it is that social interaction with you. So maybe you could think about differentially reinforcing your social interaction. So if she writes something out, maybe you could be a little less enthusiastic or not share as much about what she says, versus if she were to get really comfortable in talking about Powder Puff Girls, or you were to bring in some additional things such as stickers or coloring books or whatever it is she might enjoy. And then if she were to say even one word, then you would really engage in some great social interactions with her, make it exciting, give her lots of access to her favorite things, and kind of pull it out in that way. And as Dr. Goldsmith was saying, if she gets a little bit more comfortable, then you'll start being able to have more opportunities to differentially reinforce and kind of pull it out. And then also still thinking about shaping her behavior as well. So maybe she may not make a comment that's auditory, and maybe she'll just move her lips, and you could even start differentially reinforcing her at that point, and then start shaping it as well, where she starts to become a little bit louder, or maybe she gets a little close to your ear and she just whispers it in your ear. But thinking about where you could even start with her and then systematically shaping that as well. And then if she becomes more comfortable, you can then expose her to other situations, such as maybe bringing other peers in, and just thinking systematically about how you can desensitize and add additional steps, but taking all those steps back and kind of removing it and bringing in some of those safe components from where she's currently speaking. The other thing too is, I know that you can't probably see her outside of school. I don't know if you have any opportunities to do home-based observations. I know that I've worked in some school districts where you can go to the home for some home visits. That might be a good time to also get a little bit more information about her preferences, what she is doing when she's engaging in language at home, and maybe even thinking about identifying more about and asking more questions about what is making her feel comfortable or uncomfortable. A 5 Could Make Me Lose Control is another assessment tool where you might just get additional information about what social scenarios are more bringing more anxiety for her as well, and then how you can arrange the environment at school to start shaping that up. So I just wanted to piggyback off of that with Dr. Goldsmith, and then let's go ahead and move on to Zoe really quickly. I like how we all speed talk, as Dr. Esch was mentioning earlier.
So just really quickly, I think that I second a lot of all the recommendations that you've gotten so far. I think that maybe some information that might be helpful would be because she's able to say, I'm embarrassed, right? And that seems to be her way of describing kind of what's going on in her body, is maybe to help her, like, with a scale from 1 to 10, right? Ask her, like, how is your body feeling? 1 being really comfortable, 10 being not. Kind of where is she, so that you can begin to understand, again, sort of piggybacking on what Tina was saying, that her external affect may not always represent what's going on for her inside. And so that might help you all to gain some data in terms of, like, what environments might be most anxiety provoking, and so probably those might even differential reinforcement might not help in those situations, but areas where she's a little bit less anxious, that those might be areas that, again, you could help, those might be good starting places to kind of target, maybe encouraging some of that. I think the biggest thing that I would encourage is just, she has made a lot of progress. To take a kiddo who is being restrained, it sounds like multiple times on a daily basis, to having a kiddo who's really at this point, and I don't mean to minimize the not talking, because obviously it's a barrier to learning and engaging and all of those things, but that may be her coping mechanism right now to being able to engage socially and be at school, and she's going to class, she's sitting, she's learning, that really, to really give yourselves a lot of kudos, if you will, for helping her to get to this point. And I think it's easy to focus on, the challenges now for sure, but I think maybe also giving her a lot of positive feedback, that you understand that she's having a hard time right now with talking, but gosh, golly, she's doing a great job. And you all are doing a great job. So I think that, my recommendation maybe would just be to give yourselves a lot of credit along with the recommendations that everybody else has given. I hope that's helpful. I'm going to sign off and let other folks talk.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Dr. Soul, I would love to hear your comments.
Sure. So honestly, I have very little extra to add based on the fabulous recommendations that have already gone before me. I think that I certainly agree you guys have done a tremendous job, and I could not agree more that she needs additional outside help. This selective mutism is a really tricky thing to treat in the first place. And so thinking about other things that might be useful, truthfully, I think that counseling, some of the things that Tina and Zoe have talked about already, is first and foremost the most important priority. Of course, down the road, if that is not continuing to work well, there are, we can treat anxiety with medications, but truthfully, the studies are have very poor results, but it can still be an option. And so, I don't know, my biggest recommendation would be just to continue working with this mom to figure out ways to help her to see the impact that this is having on her daughter's schooling, and encouraging her or giving her concrete steps. I get it that it's tricky because you're with the school, and so you have to be really cautious on what you recommend versus, what the school's expected to provide and things like that. But I do definitely think that this is outside of you guys have already gone above and beyond in my mind. And so I think it's time to really bring in additional expertise. The messaging of that may be tricky, again, because you're with the school. But that would be definitely my seconded opinion from the other two lovely ladies.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Soul. Sarah Baca, I'd love to get your perspective on the communication with the family as well.
All right, I'll be fast. I'm just wondering if maybe there could be like a community night for the classroom, like maybe say for like Halloween or something, and make it like a comic book theme to where the girl would be really excited to come, the mom would attend, and then maybe meet other parents, and then also maybe have some resources available for outside activities and also outside providers that could potentially help the family. And then maybe just if you have like a really, if there's a mom there that you think is not afraid to share her story, maybe kind of I'm pretty outspoken. I like to talk a lot. So if there's a mom that you can think that could do that, maybe introduce them. And then she can start talking about things that they've done and things like that. And maybe it can just get the mom excited and engaged with the child. I'm also curious to know later on, if the restraint is playing the biggest part in this, because legislatively I'm pretty active in that front, and we do have a restraint and seclusion legislation that we're trying to get pushed through. And did this have a negative impact on this young lady, which is in turn causing more, I guess, using more resources in the school because of as a result of the restraint that was happening. So that is my 2 cents, and again, thank you for being amazing and awesome teachers.
Wonderful suggestion on a community night to be able to share resources for local agencies. I think that is a new suggestion that we've had here at ECHO, and something that I think our providers could think about and utilize for multiple parents and helping connect them with resources. So great.
I have one more. I know there's a SIB shop that we're helping with in Las Cruces, and maybe having the sister attend something like that to where it's really focused on her, and then she can help become an advocate and for her sister.
Yeah, that's
great. Great suggestion. All right. Well, Kathleen, did you have anything that you needed to add in the chat box? Okay. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation, Morgan and Cosette. I hope that you are walking away with some ideas. We will actually email you a recommendation form with everything that was presented from everybody today, including the wonderful ideas from our audience participants. And as I was reading through those, I love to see that a lot of their recommendations are things that the panelists were recommending, and we just have such a lovely group of very intelligent individuals that are joining us today. So thank you all for all of your feedback and comments as well.